Fate Be Changed, Chapter 17, Merida. Merida grabbed one of the hooks overhead and stuck a lean venison loin through it. She slid the slab of meat down the line and repeated the action with another. Sorcha had taken cubes of the fresh venison to the kitchens an hour earlier so that it could be added to a stew for the night's meal. Merida debated whether to up her price for each teaching the lessons survival skills in the form of demanding dishes that contained meat. After eating vegetable pottage for the second day in a row, her body screamed for more sustenance. Better to get her mind off food and focused on more important things, like orchestrating another meeting between Fergus and the princess. Their first encounter might not have gone quite as planned, but once those two realized they were perfect for each other, Merida could go back to her normal life. The door to the wet larder swung open and Eileen marched in. "Come with me." She exited the room as quickly as she had entered. Merida hesitated, unsure if she could trust Eileen. She reminded herself that she must not give anyone a reason to have her dismissed from this job. She wiped her hands with a square of linen before making sure her hair was secured under the shawl. When she entered the kitchen, she found Sorcha and one of the scullery maids standing against the wall, holding platters piled high with food. Both girls looked as frightened as mice. 3 of the servers came down with the flux and had to take to the beds, Eileen announced. "You need to stand in. Have you ever served before?" No, not really," Merida said. Eileen rolled her eyes. "Useless," she muttered. "You will carry the dishes to the tables and remove them when the king and queen have had their fill. You are not to be seen or heard, do you hear me, lass?" "Not to be seen?" Merida asked. "How can that be if I'm to bring in and then clear the dishes?" Eileen released an irritated sigh. "I mean that you were to be quiet, that they should barely notice you are even there." She shoved a warm loaf of bread and wrapped in cloth into Merida's arms. "Get in line." Merida followed the other girls out of the kitchen, but not before stealthily lifting a small knife from the sideboard. She tucked it under the belt of her waist and hid it within the folds of her tunic. She would use it to scrape off the bristles that had formed on her jaw. Merida could not figure out what had caused the tiny black hairs to sprout. She and the others entered the great hall, and Merida was immediately taken aback by the unexpected opulence of the space. The great hall at Castle Dunbrock was nicely appointed, but it was nothing compared to this. She looked up at the ceiling that soared above her with its thick, crisscrossing beams. Dozens of meticulously designed tapestries hung from the rafters. Like the others she had taken notice of in the castle, they seemed to tell a story, alternating between scenes of fierce battles and wholesome family celebrations. Shields and suits of armor adorned with the walls on either side. In the center of the black wall hung a remarkable display of claymores, battle axes, and other weaponry. The candlelight gleamed against their shiny surfaces. Merida was so focused on her surroundings that she did not notice Sorcha had stopped walking. The bread's crusty outer layer crackled underneath the towel as she slammed into the girl's back. "Pay attention, lass," Sorcha whispered over her shoulder. Suddenly the bread, the tapestries, and everything else became a blur. Merida's entire focus honed in on the 2 people sitting at either end of the long wooden table. Her grandparents. The most she had ever seen of them was a tapestry that hung in the drawing room at Castle Dunbrock. Merida had known that her mother and grandmother shared a likeness, but to see Queen Katerina in the flesh was jarring. It was as if she was looking at the face of the mother who had raised her. From their dark auburn hair to that patrician nose, the 2 women could have been identical twins born decades apart. Merida finally took notice of the younger Eleanor and her wide-eyed expression. It was clear that she had not expected to see Merida outside the great hall that night, if ever. But Merida could not think about Eleanor then. She was too curious about the king and queen. "Do not stare," Sorcha whispered. "Remember, lass, seen and not heard." Merida tried to keep her head about her. She must behave as if she were a regular member of the household staff. She would not draw attention to herself. She mimicked the other girls, gently placing her loaf of bread next to the bowl of turnips and promptly falling back in line, taking her cues from Sorcha. Merida clasped her hands in front of her and stood mutely as the family ate their dinner. "The tutor reported you seemed absent-minded in your lessons today," King Douglas McCameron pronounced. It was the first time Merida had ever heard her grandfather's voice. She was mesmerized by the rich, deep cadence. But the more she heard him speak, the less captivating she found him. The words he spoke were appalling. Merida clutched her hands into fists as she listened to the king reprimand Eleanor for the grave offense of being caught looking out of the window during her Latin lesson. Merida did worse things before she had even had a chance to break her fast most mornings. She looked at Queen Katerina to see if she would intervene on her daughter's behalf, but the queen's expression was indifferent as she bit into a chunk of venison. It was such a disappointment to see the grandparents she had put on a pedestal in her fantasies treat their daughter, her mother, in this way, and at the dinner table, no less. Merida could not help thinking about all the time she had thought her mother was being hard on her children, especially her eldest daughter. That was nothing compared to how Eleanor's own parents treated her. "You must understand how this makes me look, Eleanor," her grandfather said. "Every misstep you take reflects badly on the kingdom. I will not stand for it." He slapped his flat palm against the table for emphasis, knocking over a goblet. Eileen, who had joined Merida and the other girls in their posts next to the wall, ran to the king's side to swipe up the spilled ale. A smirk curved the corner of her mouth as she returned to stand against the wall. She was enjoying this. Something about the princess being dressed down by her father amused Eileen. Merida wished she could take what remained in that goblet and toss it in Eileen's face. As she stared helplessly at Eleanor's bowed head, Merida began to understand more about why her mother was the way she was. King Douglas and Queen Katerina required perfection and deemed anything less unacceptable. When asked a question, Eleanor gave answers that were low and monosyllabic. She looked defeated and embarrassed. Merida ached for her. The dinner went on for another excruciating half hour, with the king lecturing his daughter about her responsibilities as a member of the royal family. It was obvious the king and queen believed carrying out one's duties was of utmost importance. But did they have to be so exacting? After he finished the food on his plate, the king held up a hand. Both Eleanor and Queen Katerina immediately set down their utensils, even though both still had several bites of food remaining. Eileen directed the girls to follow her, but Merida remained still, unable to believe that the two women at the table would stop eating their meals simply because the king had concluded his. Eileen turned back to Merida with a blistering look, motioning her to get to the table. Merida once again followed Sorcha's lead. She collected the square of cloth the bread had been wrapped in, along with a mostly empty platter that held a few carrots lingering in butter. Eileen approached the king and asked, "Will you be having dessert tonight, King Douglas?" The king nodded before taking a sip from his goblet, and then pronounced, "The chieftain of Clan Fraser and his eldest son will be joining us for dinner in 2 days." He settled his gaze directly on his daughter. "You are to be on your best behavior when your betrothal arrives, Eleanor." Merida dropped the platter she carried. She gasped as the porcelain shattered and watched helplessly as carrots rolled onto the floor and under the table. "What are you doing?" Eileen hissed at her. I am sorry," Merida stuttered. The king and queen looked at her with matching expressions of shock and censor. Eleanor's eyes were wide with alarm. "I am sorry," Merida said again. She looked at all 3 members of the royal family, her family, and tried to process the words she had just heard spoken by the king. Eleanor was already betrothed? She scurried out of the great hall, running through the kitchens and out the door and led to the yard. Merida flattened her back against the castle's stone wall, sucking in slow, deep breaths in an effort to calm herself. It was not working. She pushed away from the wall and paced back and forth, clutching her fabric-covered head in her hands. Was it possible she had heard him wrong? Or that the king was mistaken? Why would her grandfather tell Eleanor that she was meeting her betrothed? The princess herself said the Highland Games were not for a fortnight, so the competition for the princess's hand could not possibly have already taken place. So how could Eleanor's betrothed be a guest at an upcoming dinner? And why was he from Clan Fraser and not Clan Dunbrock?